Well, I think sometimes horror helps us to process the real nightmares out there. And I think you see this in sort of unhealthy way with conspiracies and conspiracy theories. I think it is kind of like we were talking about the vastness of the universe. It is terrifying. It is more terrifying to me to think about how absolutely depraved people can be to each other and the horrible things they can do to each other than to think there's, some non-human monster out there. If there's a non-human monster murdering young girls, we can all band together and go hunt that monster down and kill it. And now we have ended we've done something wonderful together. We've overcome a great difficulty and we've ended its scourge. It will no longer trouble our community, right? Unfortunately, in the real world, you can't do that because it's not just one monster, it's many, and they're people, and they often hide in plain sight. So I often think that horror helps us to sort of conceptualize that and deal with that and experience the bad things that can happen in life from a safe vantage point. Watching horror on your television screen and experiencing it that way is much better than watching the news, frankly.
Right.
I find the news to be far more terrifying than real life horror. And I often say that to people. It always surprises me. We do these October episodes and they're really just true crime, but they've got they'll have a little hint of whatever. And people are like, oh, I can't listen to that. That's scary. And I think to myself, God,
that's so funny. I find them less scary.
Yeah. It's like all year round, we're talking about real terror.
That's Brett Talley, an author of several best-selling novels and anthologies, including He Who Walks in the Shadows, That Which Should Not Be, and The Fiddle is the Devil's Instrument. This is Jayson Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. This is the second of 2 episodes with Brett. The first was released yesterday on October 30th, and it explores similar issues with a focus on where many of our horror stories and myths come from, how they've been used over time to explain things that we cannot always face head on, and to help do things like make sure children go to sleep at night. We talk in that episode a lot about Stephen King and the power of horror stories to give us deeper meaning, and authors like H.P. Lovecraft, whose nihilistic cosmic horror helps us question the meaning of life. We also touch on how some stories from the world of horror and science fiction helped, in a positive way, to shape our values. If you've not listened to that episode, I encourage you to do so. Brett has been twice nominated for the Bram Stoker Award for Superior Achievement, the top award for horror writing, presented annually by the Horror Writers Association. The works of writers are nominated for the Bram Stoker Award, which is named after the Irish Victorian-era Gothic fiction writer who is the author of Dracula, by juries and members of the Horror Writers Association. That Which Should Not Be was Brett's first novel, and it was published in 2011. In addition to being nominated for the Bram Stoker Award for a writer's first novel, it was a semi-finalist for the Goodreads Choice Awards and the winner of the Journal Stone Horror Writing Contest. That Which Should Not Be takes readers on a journey to Miskatonic University, a fictional school with a whispered reputation for being connected to the occult and supernatural, where a professor and a student search a nearby village for a book that's believed to control all the non-human forces that rule the earth. The pair bring the book back to Miskatonic University, opening a gate into the netherworld. Brett was also nominated for a 2014 anthology, Limbus Inc., Book 2, that he edited. In the book, 5 masters of horror, fantasy, and science fiction writing take readers into a world of time travel, human sacrifice, intergalactic beings, and more. Brett is also the author of several true ghost stories and a nonfiction book called Haunted Tuscaloosa. which explores the paranormal in an Alabama town, from a now shuttered local insane asylum and antebellum mansion said to be haunted by ghosts to cemeteries where Confederate soldiers are still said to march, and ghost stories from the University of Alabama grounds. Brett is an attorney, and his interests include horror, science fiction, the paranormal, and the whodunnits and what's done it that all leave us wondering. He's the host also of the Prosecutors podcast, where he and his co-host Alice LaCour tackle well-known and less well-known true crime cases. But they also tackle some mysteries, some flat-out hard-to-explain events. Over the years, they've written about Dyatlov Pass, an incident where 9 Soviet hikers died under mysterious circumstances in the Ural Mountains. And, also from Russia, the 1993 Kamar-Dabain incident, where 6 hikers disappeared in the mountains near the enormous Lake Baikal in southern Siberia. They've covered whether the moon is hollow, the Salem witch trials, the mystery of whether the Soviets lost cosmonauts in space, and the story of Adolfo Constantes, who surely believed he could use human sacrifice and magic to move cocaine into the United States from Mexico. Alice calls Brett a true Renaissance man, and I happen to agree. The Prosecutors podcast was the 2023 winner of the People's Choice Creator of the Year Award at CrimeCon. This October, Brett and Alice have told weeks of real-life horror stories related to all sorts of things, from the 1987 story of Ruthie Mae McCoy, the chilling story of the murder of a woman, through people breaking through her medicine cabinet that led to the movie Candyman, and what Brett and Alice called the man who killed Halloween, the 1974 case of Ryan Clark O'Brien, who killed his 8-year-old son Timothy by lacing his pixie sticks with potassium cyanide. Today, we're going to continue our discussion of the paranormal, horror, science fiction, and all the mysterious and spooky stuff, both in fiction and in reality. I was going to ask you about something different, because I'm sitting here right now wearing a Prosecutors podcast Dyatlov Pass sweatshirt that is quite comfy, by the way. But one of the things that I'm curious about, that like it actually, I don't know if I've told you this, I think what actually hooked me on your podcast, or the first thing I was exposed to, was some of your coverage of current cases. And, you know, with the podcast, you hear one episode, I think I had been searching for a certain topic, came across it, listened. But along the way, in my early listening, I tripped across some of your mysteries that aren't traditionally true crime. And one is Dyatlov Pass, which is now, at least this year, you know, I went on vacation and that was my binge on my vacation. But, you know, could you tell us some of those stories, like Dyatlov Pass, Kuiper Domain, why you guys decided to take on these stories? I feel like you have a fascination with mysteries, which is kind of funny to me, because you are the person who said during your coverage of the Adnan Syed case that if it takes 2 conspiracies for it to be true, you don't believe it. But I'm like, is there some kind of attraction to you to things that truly just can't be explained, because so much can be?
I would like to think I'm the best kind of skeptic, because I want to look at all these things critically, but I really want to find a true mystery.
You're Fox Mulder. You're Fox Mulder. The truth is out there. I want to believe. Trust no one. Right.
Exactly. I want to believe. And my thing, the thing I don't want to believe, I don't want the world to be boring. I really don't. I mean, a boring world is boring, right?
Yes, so true.
So I want there to be mysteries, you know, I want to believe in paranormal things, you know, I want there to be unexplainable things that, you know, can't just be explained by 2 atoms colliding in the right way. Right. And so what always fascinated me, and one of the reasons I always liked horror and sort of a spinoff of that, are mysteries, unsolved mysteries. Going back, you talk about another thing from the 80s that shapes you, the old Robert Stack, Unsolved Mysteries.
Yeah,
definitely.
the show. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And my favorite part of it, I mean, I enjoyed the crime parts of those, but my favorite parts were always, they'd always stick like, an alien abduction or a haunting or a poltergeist or something in there. There would always be one story that was like that. And so
I called them the Twilight Zone episodes.
there you go. The Twilight Zone episodes, exactly. And at some point, I had, I'd written the books, done the horror thing, and it wasn't that I was tired of horror, but I was kind of looking for something that was a little bit different. I think I read like The Lost City of Z, which is a great book if you haven't read it. It's about the search for a lost city and someone who disappeared looking for it. And sort of what happened to them? Where'd they go? And that sort of sparked my interest in this whole sort of mysterious thing. And I had been for a long time. I don't know if do you remember the old, I don't know if it's old anymore. I mean, I guess it's old. Crack.com. Did you ever go to crack.com?
Yeah.
Okay. I used to love crack.com. I assume they're still going, but they're like a listicle site for those of you who don't know. And they would always have like 5, most inexplicable mysteries. And there would be an article on them and you read them. And I always enjoyed that. And I remember one time
I didn't know people
one.
actually went to that site. I always end up accidentally hitting the ads to it.
I think that's how I ended up there initially. You're right. Their advertising's great because it tricks you into going there, right? And so then I was like, so I'll start reading this stuff. And there was one article that was like 5 mysteries with obvious explanations. And that was where I learned about Dyatlov Pass. And it was Dyatlov Pass, which is, for those of you who don't know, is a place in the Urals in Russia where in 1959, 9 hikers, they went up there on it wasn't, I'm not going to call it routine. It was a difficult hike, but they were highly experienced, highly skilled, really great leader. And they died in just incredibly mysterious circumstances. Basically, they don't show up at home. People come looking for them. They find their tent. It's cut from the inside, but all their stuff is still in there, their shoes and their clothes. They see footprints in the sand or in the snow, and they're literally footprints because they're not wearing shoes, but maybe a couple of them are wearing shoes, and they're leading off down the hill away from the tent, which is safety, obviously. And it's super cold. I mean, we're talking about like minus 20 degrees. Follow them down, and they find all these people dead in all of them in very different circumstances. And so they all died at different times in different places in different ways. And it's too much to go over in less than, I think, 6 episodes. Is that what it took us to do it?
Five, I think.
5 episodes. Yeah. Man, if we did it now, it'd be 10 easy. But and in the crack.com article was like, it's paradoxical undressing. They just got cold, took their clothes off and died. And I was like, that doesn't seem right. And so then I ended up down the rabbit hole on that and just got obsessed with it. So when we did the podcast, I was like, I don't want it just to be true crime. Love true crime. One of the reasons I like true crime is the mysteries. Most of the cases we do are unsolved. Right. We really like the unsolved ones. I mean, we do solved ones too, but to me, the ones that are the most fun are when you don't know why it happened or who did it and sort of trying to untangle all that.
Yep.
And when we decided to do that, it was like, we are going to include some of these mysteries. So Dyatlov Pass is one of them. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse.
Yes.
Three lighthouse keepers who disappear. And when the relief ship shows up, they find everything's pretty much in order. And, the coats hanging from the things and the doors closed and everything is like, where do these people go? And it's become a great mystery. The Mary Celeste, which is a ship that was found sailing across the ocean, seemingly perfectly fine, but with no crew. The entire crew and the captain are gone. Like, what happened to it? And that's one I remember learning about in grade school. And that's a really famous one.
Sorry.
And then the Khmer Daban, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, but is another group of hikers in Russia who go up a mountain and then all but one die. And because the one didn't die, we know the story. And the story is so much stranger than you would have imagined because they're literally just walking up this mountain and all of a sudden everyone but her start vomiting blood and just all sort of drop dead, and she runs off into the woods and survives. What happened there? Who knows, right? But it's those kind of mysteries. I love those mysteries and I love looking into them, and I like sharing them with people and seeing, what do you think about this? Is this as mysterious to you? Do you have an obvious answer? I mean, that's the thing I think I probably enjoy the most about the podcast.
Yeah. And because I do see the connection between the unsolved cases. Did you have to sell Alice on the idea of doing ones like that, Left Boss, or was she like down for that?
Man, Alice, she's down. She's down for doing anything on the podcast. She's great. You don't have to twist her arm. I mean, the fact that she'll do all the October episodes with me, and she just talk about somebody who does not like horror at all, which is kind of wild for somebody who does true crime. But the thing is, we use the same approach. I mean, we look at the evidence, we try and put out a timeline, we try and follow exactly what happened, eliminate the wilder conspiracy theories. Though in some of those cases, the conspiracy theories seem to be the most likely ones.
Yeah.
And also that's a little different because, like you were saying, I mean, typically when we look at the true crime cases, I mean, look, usually it's simple. Usually what actually happened in any true crime case is pretty straightforward and simple. It's not going to be complicated. It's not going to have a lot of conspiracies. If you can eliminate all that, you'll see the truth. And that's fun, and I like doing that. And I like unraveling things for people and using Alice and my experience to do so. But I still really love those mysteries, right?
Yeah.
So I always found myself drawn back to them.
Well, it's kind of to your point that you made before. It would really suck if the world is boring, and while Occam's razor, like the simplest, the thing that requires the simplest or the least amount of sort of jumps or conclusions is a powerful tool to use, it gets kind of boring after a while. I listen to a lot of true crime cases that people debate on Reddit and they're talking about, and I find myself consuming all the information very often and being like, well, I know you have 19 theories, but this is pretty simple. The husband did it, right? Like, so maybe like it would be a boring world if everything involved Occam's razor.
Yeah, and look, I mean, sometimes the husband doesn't do it, right?
But, occasionally.
But I just feel like, and we talk about this sometimes, people talk about the behavioral analysis unit, and they're, they make television shows about it, and everybody loves behavioral analysis, and they just think it's the most amazing thing in the world. But where do they start? What's the first thing they do?
Stats.
They just look at statistics. Yeah,
yep.
They look at statistics.
Stats.
Who's the victim? How old is she? Because unfortunately, it's usually a woman. How old is she? What race is she? Is she married? Does she have a boyfriend? Oh, okay. Okay. Well, then it's
gotta rule those out.
27-year-old ex-boyfriend is
right.
most likely the person who did it, and maybe he didn't. But that's sort of where you start from. And I always kind of think one weird thing people do in true crime sometimes is they try and start from a position of, I am going to be completely unbiased and just start as if anything's possible. And it's like, that's actually probably not the best place to start.
Right. That would be like throwing out all the scientific evidence that we have and trying coming up with some new scientific idea. That you really want to start with the knowledge. Like our friend Julia Calley, who used to work in the behavioral analysis unit, and who I'm going to make a plug for her really cool podcast, The Consult, which should be coming out again any minute now, since this is Halloween. But one of the things that she told me that I really learned from talking to her is, that point that you were making about looking at statistics and going through the data and looking at the most common solutions allows you to eliminate possibilities. But then when you get to a point where you've eliminated all the possibilities, you have sort of like that extraordinary evidence that calls for something extraordinary happened here, like a serial killer, for example, or the husband didn't do it, and those are, to me, going back to your point about unsolved mysteries. Do you remember the TV show Without a Trace?
I do.
Yeah. Like, there's a reason why it's fascinating when it can't simply be explained. Right. Yeah. And it's just interesting to me that people will jump to the mystery, and I think we often will, without eliminating the obvious ones, if that makes sense. Maybe
the thing is, usually, even if it seems mysterious, it's just because we're missing something. And if we saw the thing that we were missing, we'd be like, oh, of course.
Right.
Oh, I didn't think about that. Right.
Right.
Like one of the most mysterious cases we ever did was, and I forget his name. It was the guy, the Super Bowl, and he was supposed to watch Super Bowl. He was a big fan of the Dallas Cowboys, and they were playing the Super Bowl. And his wife had gone off to
He's the
David
one who
Lewis. David
disappeared and
Lewis.
showed up in the Northwest.
Right. So he lives in Texas. He turns on the record function manually of his VCR, makes himself a sandwich. Then his wife comes home a couple days later. Sandwich is sitting on the table. The Super Bowl is recorded. He's nowhere to be seen. Turns out the next day, he was the victim of a hit and run outside of like Tacoma, Washington. And it's completely inexplicable. How in the world did that happen? Why was he up there? Who knows, right? And but you feel like, as inexplicable as it is, if we just knew one more piece of information, maybe all of a sudden everything would fall into place. But for now, it's completely inexplicable.
And is that the one where he had like, there was supposed to be a meeting he was supposed to go to downtown, and like but there was clearly something in the middle, some tiny piece that we were missing. Yeah.
It's like on Saturday, he goes and prices a basketball goal for his daughter. On Sunday, he starts to watch the Super Bowl. On Monday, he's hit by a car 2,000 miles away.
Yeah, we're definitely missing something there. But so in a weird way, it sounds like it comes from, like you're able to sort of like logically work yourself through. Well, I'll just say what I said about you. I'm like, this guy is so smart. He's able to logically solve a lot of puzzles that we can't. So I bet it is wonderful for him when he finds a puzzle he can't solve.
Oh yeah. I mean, I love it. I mean, I love inexplicable mysteries. I really do. And I really try and not like, look, we did the whole moon is hollow episode. I think it'd be awesome if the moon was hollow. You talk about an interesting development. But unfortunately, it's probably not, right?
It doesn't have a spacecraft in the middle of it?
It probably is not.
No, you don't think that's it? Oh, boo.
I'm saying probably. I'm leaving out. There might be a chance.
We haven't checked.
We haven't looked yet. We need to drill down in there and see.
But yeah, and I think that it kind of probably one of the things for me, I guess, like I have always thinking about the writing and thinking about your books, which I've read several of. I'm like finishing the last of the readings right now, your Haunted Tuscaloosa book. But one of the things that's always been interesting to me about writing, as somebody who comes from the nonfiction side, who originally for me, my first love was fiction, but I found that I think as I wrote, there were two things that got in my way. One, I couldn't write realistic dialogue. And two, I always felt like real life was so crazy, I couldn't make this up. So I naturally gravitated toward nonfiction. I've tried my hand at writing on occasion fiction, but I've never been satisfied with it in the same way that I am with my nonfiction writing. So it's amazing to me when I read something like your books, where I'm reading dialogue and I'm reading writing that feels as real as a nonfiction book. But then you throw another layer on top of it, and it's even weirder to me that I'm reading this thing that's about the supernatural, or it's about horror, things I don't know existed, but that you've written them, and you and other writers can write them in a way that they feel so realistic. It almost seems insurmountable to me as a nonfiction writer. I'm just curious about that whole process behind that.
Well, I think the first thing you have to we always talk about how readers have to suspend their disbelief. I think writers have to suspend their disbelief too. Like, you have to believe it first. And if you believe it and you accept that this is the real world that you're inventing, then it feels less like making it up and more like you're just sort of telling a real story, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you're so ingrained in the story that you're able to say, well, this is what the character would do in this situation, as opposed to, because you feel it, you're in it. You're in the middle of the universe.
And I think No, I think that's 100% right. And I think the way I always wrote things, and different people, everybody's different. You know how it is. Everybody's different in the way they do things. But things like dialogue, if you can sort of, for me, it was always, if I could imagine these two people having this conversation, like, what would they say? What would they actually, how would they actually talk? And obviously, you don't want it to be exactly like they would talk because that's boring too. That's the weird thing about realistic dialogue is it can't be too realistic or nobody will want to read it. So you have this very fine line. It's sort of like Facebook reality, right? Like,
yes,
that's what you want.
Fiction writing.
Oh yeah, and I mean, for me, the hardest part, I don't think I'm that creative. So for me, the coming up with the ideas was always the hard part. Like, what in the world is this story going to be about? And I'm always amazed by people. Stephen King, it's like, if you come up with an idea and you're like, oh, wow, I have the most original idea ever. Stephen King has absolutely written a short story about it. It's kind of like The Simpsons. The Simpsons have covered everything at this point.
Yes, right.
Yep. Stephen King's written every story. He's written every story that's ever going to be written. So just ignore that fact and write your own thing anyway.
Right. Well, and that's also a part of it. Like, I think all of these different things, to your point, sort of have built on each other, even before Dracula, but certainly the Victorian era pushing forward. When you are writing something like that, like, one of your horror pieces, do you find yourself kind of living in that world? Do you become so immersed in it at times? Like, I've always wondered what that feels like I always think of something like the book Gone Girl, and I'm like, was that person losing their mind when they read that one? Or, which by the way should be counted as a horror book.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. It's one of those real life nightmares. But like, do you immerse yourself in it completely, or how does that work?
So I'm sure, once again, different people are different ways, but I do. It's one reason that since we've started the podcast, I really haven't done a whole lot of writing, because writing for me is one of those things that when I'm doing it, it's basically all I want to do. If I am writing, when I wrote that first book, when I wrote That Which Should Not Be, which is still my favorite of all of them, I loved writing that book so much. And it was a joy to be able to get away from, I would cancel things with friends. I would do whatever to get home and be able to sit down and write that book, because in my mind all day, all I'd been thinking about is sort of the next scene and how I'm going to write it and what's going to happen next. And I think that's probably why it is the best of them, because it was really a passion project, right? I mean, I was passionate about it and totally into it. And, doing all the research about the locations and what kind of matches did they use back then? Did they have lighters back then? I don't even know. Like, all that stuff, because it's set, 150 years ago or so, and trying and all that stuff. It was just, I just loved doing it. And I was completely into it. So for me, yes, it is just completely immersive. I can't imagine writing some of the stuff. My books are horror, but I would call them sort of joyous horror.
Sure.
Going back to Pet Cemetery, I can't imagine the emotional toil and the emotional toll that would take on you to do that every day, to sit down and write that book. I mean, it must have just ripped out part of his soul, which is probably one reason it's so good. Right. But yes, to me, you can't. And I'm going to say you can't, even though I recognize, as I said, everybody's different. But for me, you can't really write here or there. Like, it grabs you, and once it gets you, you can't get out of it.
What the story of That Which Should Not Be, which is the first story. Tell us a little bit about the story and the inspiration for it.
So I didn't think I could write a book. I didn't think I had written a lot of short stuff and sort of short horror. And I always found writing short stories to be really hard. I don't know why, but it just seemed like so hard. And I was like, man, if it's this hard to write a 1,500 word thing, writing a 100,000 word thing must just be impossible. But at some point I decided I was going to do it. I had a friend who was an incredible writer, and she was like, she wanted to work on a book, which think she's still working on it. One day it's going to be finished. It's going to be amazing. Everybody's going to be blown away by it because I've read part of it. It's incredible. But I was like, I tried to encourage her because I had read the first part of it. And I was like, this is amazing. You got to write the rest of this. And so I was like, we'll have a race. We'll see who can write a book first. And that was the whole thing. It was going to be a race. And I was just doing it to encourage her. But then I came up with a story, which basically it's 4 stories with sort of an overarching story tying them all together. And I'd always wanted to write something about the Wendigo. I'm fascinated by the Wendigo. I think it's one of the most interesting legends, Native American legends there is. Just really messes with your brain to think about it. And I'd always wanted to write something about that. And so basically I was like, well, I was going to write a Wendigo story. So I'm going to have a Wendigo story. That's going to be my first one. And then I had to come up with sort of what is everybody's motivation here, and then I essentially just wrote like a paragraph for each of the stories and a couple sentences for the overarching story. And that was my guide, basically. And then everything else, like I said, I'm not very creative. So once I had the ideas, everything else was just fleshing it out. And then it became easy because I find it really easy to be creative once you have the basic idea, because then you're just reacting to what's happening in this world you've created, right?
And
what
the Wendigo,
most logical thing.
Isn't the Wendigo it's the Native American one where it sort of like invokes sort of, I think, what is it? Feelings of like greed, hunger, the need to cannibalize, that kind of stuff like that. And, but it's like a human, but not real. It's like humanoid, right? And ice cold and all this other wild stuff.
And it can possess people.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And so people have claimed to
have the psychosis. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Wendigo psychosis. Exactly. To have been under the effect of the Wendigo when they did horrible things and murdered people and cannibalized them. And so taking that idea and sort of, turning it into a story of these men who are going off into the wilderness, and one by one they start disappearing.
Right.
And, and then tying it all back together, because my idea, the central idea of this was in the sort of everything that I've ever written, the central idea has been that in legend, there are truths in every legend. Right. And so it was, imagine sort of a Lovecraftian conception of the universe is true. Well, if that's true, then everything that you've ever heard, every legend you've ever heard, everything you've ever believed is really just a way. It's kind of like we were talking about at the very beginning. It's just a way for you to conceptualize something you can't otherwise understand. So, the Wendigo is actually one of these sort of Lovecraftian entities, right? And a lot of the things that are happening, there are sort of, there's one where you think they're going to be vampires, but there aren't, right? Like these various other things. And they all tie into this notion of this sort of Lovecraftian idea. And then the overarching story, of course, ties them all together in that and brings in sort of all this lore from different places and stories from various people. And I just love that stuff. And I love incorporating all that historical stuff into the horror. And also, we talked about Haunted Tuscaloosa. Same thing. Like, the more history you can get into it, to me, as someone who loves history, the better it is.
Yeah, that was interesting. You were saying, what kind of matches do they have around that time? That, Haunted Tuscaloosa is a really good one because it's almost like a different genre of sort of like real life places with their own ghost stories and other stories. How did you end up into those kind of stories? I remember reading somewhere, where did I may have read it in the Washington Post or Newsweek or somewhere. Oh, actually both. But that you were a part of a paranormal research group in Tuscaloosa. You are a man of many things.
So it's funny that the way that happened was I was in Tuscaloosa, and that's when I was writing That Which Should Not Be. One of the stories, you may recall, takes place in a old insane asylum.
Yes.
And Tuscaloosa, for whatever reason, and I'm sure many of our opposing football fans would get a kick out of this, has more insane asylums than you would think.
Really?
It became, yes, in the mid 1800s, it became sort of a place, a very sort of forward thinking area for mental health research. And so Bryce Hospital opens in Tuscaloosa. It's one of the old Kirkbride style approaches to mental health, and became sort of a center for that sort of thing. So you had Bryce, then you had Partlow, which was for youth with severe mental illness. You have, I forget the name of it, but there is still to this day a basically hospital for the criminally insane. So a prison, but a prison hospital for the criminally insane. There is another place that the Jemison Center, which was it was like a work release. And work release is not the right word, but it was a place that people could go who had mental illnesses, maybe had developmental difficulties, and they could learn to work and that sort of thing.
Kind of like a vocational outpatient
exactly
kind of transition.
So you had all these places, but then as the money dried up and sort of we got away from the idea of institutionalizing people, they closed and they became abandoned, and they became the center for all sorts of ghost stories, right? And actually the Jemison Center we write about in Haunted Tuscaloosa. But I was writing this book, and I was going to have an insane asylum, and I thought I should go there and see what it looks like.
Oh, that's fascinating.
That will be useful sort of research for this. But the problem is I'm an inveterate rule follower and I didn't want to trespass at the place, right? Because people at Alabama would go there all the time and like break in and like scare themselves, but I didn't want to trespass at the place.
Empty? Was it abandoned at that point?
It's abandoned. It's been abandoned for a long time.
Okay. They're fascinating, that Kirkbride building model that during that whole era, I think it was like probably until the 1880s. But I think maybe there's one hospital system that still has it, McLean, up in Belmont, Massachusetts. But you'll laugh at this. I have friends who recently moved into a condo into one of those old, beautiful Kirkbride hospitals that's now been converted into condos.
Yeah, and that was probably at the one just outside of Boston.
Yep.
Oh God, I can't believe I can't. It's actually that place was the inspiration for the Arkham Asylum in Batman.
I didn't know that.
It was also the inspiration for Arkham Asylum in Lovecraft, which is where the name comes from for Batman. It is the what is the name of that place? And if you've seen Session 9, it is the insane asylum where Session 9 was filmed.
Tell me about Session 9
there.
I've heard people say it's scary.
Session 9 is scary. It's a fantastic movie. And basically,
it's the Danvers. It's Danvers State Hospital.
That's
the one.
Danvers State Hospital.
Yep.
So Session 9 is set in Danvers, and it's as they're renovating it, they're going to tear down. It's so funny because what's happening in Session 9 happened in real life. They had to go in, they had to take out all the asbestos, all that stuff, clear it all out. Then they tore down a bunch of it, and then they converted the rest of it into condominiums.
Haven't they seen Poltergeist?
Exactly. I mean, the whole thing is just... it's a beautiful building. It sits up on a hill. It's like... It's really creepy. It's inspired so many things. And that's sort of what I was thinking. I was thinking about that exact thing when I wanted to go look at this place. So I get on YouTube... trying to see their videos. I can just watch videos. And one of the videos was for this group, this Tuscaloosa Paranormal Research Group. And they apparently went there all the time. So I was like, okay, I'm going to join these people. I'm going to join this group. And then I'll get to go. And I joined, and I was with them for 2 years. And we did so many fun things, went so many places. Never went there. That was the one place. That was the one place never went. But that's how I ended up being a part of that.
Yeah, those places are so fascinating that I was actually wrong, because there's one other place that definitely still fits that model, and that's St. Elizabeth's. Have you ever been there in Washington?
No.
Oh, it's so fascinating because not only does it have those beautiful buildings, but like a lot of those Kirkbride models, even though they had these beautiful grounds, they were all connected underground by tunnels. So you walked in these creepy tunnels. And like the ones at St. Elizabeth's are so unbelievably creepy because you can fit like two people in them, and the nurses and the doctors all travel through them to the different buildings. But like if there were a patient in there who was dangerous, you were not getting out of that tunnel. So I mean, they're great horror settings. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, they're fantastic. And the whole idea was you made them beautiful because they thought a beautiful setting will help the mind.
Right.
So that's why they built them like that. And if you've ever seen them, I mean, they're just gorgeous. The Bryce Hospital is actually on the University of Alabama campus, and they
Mm.
have now purchased that whole facility and converted it into like these beautiful office buildings. Basically, they're now in that
Okay.
building. But yeah, I mean, I'm interested in all that stuff. That history is a fascinating history,
Mm.
and you're right. It is ripe for horror, and you see that a lot. And there's a reason it works, because there is something inherently.
There's a reality there.
Yeah, the reality of it makes it more scary.
Yes. And it's probably on some levels, just having been in some of those places, the horror is probably more palatable than some of the sad horror that actually exists there. So that led to the sort of interest in ghosts and tell me about the ghost stories.
So I wrote the book with a buddy of mine who was a member, I think still is a member of Tuscaloosa Paranormal Research. And basically the History Press was doing those books basically all over the South. They had people who were writing the ghost story books of every little area, and they had reached out to him to see if he wanted to do one about Tuscaloosa. And he reached out to me, and basically he said he has all the research. He can do all the research. He knows everything about these places, but he wasn't a great writer, and he wanted to know if I would write it. So basically we worked together. And my thought on it was, I want this to basically be a history book with ghost stories. Now, the ghost stories are the hook. And we'll tell you the ghost stories.
I'm going to tell you a history story along the way.
But really, I'm going to tell you about the history of all this place. You're going to learn so much about the history of this area and this place and what went on there. And then we'll also include the ghost stories. And some of the ghost stories are much more, full-throated than others. I mean, some of them were just places I wanted to talk about, and there's a little bit of a ghost story. And some of them are legitimately regarded as being haunted, and are places that we went, places that we did investigations in. I mean, that 2 years when I was writing that book and doing that was probably some of the most fun that I've had in my entire sort of post law school career.
Tell me about what was like, and what are some of the things that stuck out to you? There were almost 20. I think I counted a little short of 20 different places in Tuscaloosa that you identified and read about.
And we divided it between the university and the city. So the university, and both are very steeped in history. Tuscaloosa has been around. Well, it's been around ever since it was a Native American camp when DeSoto arrived. And Chief Tuscaloosa is the reason the city is named what it is. So it has a lot of history throughout the founding period and the pre-Civil War period, the antebellum South, the Civil War period, post-Civil War, Reconstruction. I mean, all of it has happened in Tuscaloosa. You've seen it sort of go through. So there was a lot on the university side. In particular, University of Alabama was a military college during the period of the Confederacy. And so when the Union Army came through, they actually burned most of it.
Did they really? I had no idea.
They did. They burned the library, as a matter of fact. It's funny. There was one book. Of all the things, this is a random. They burned the library, and my understanding is only one book was saved. It was a copy of the Quran, of all things.
Wow.
Yeah. Somebody went in and I don't know if it was rare. I don't actually know really the history of the book, but grabbed the book and got out.
Oh, wow.
And so that book is now obviously in prominent display in the new library.
Wow.
But a lot of it was burned. There were cadets there who shot a Union soldier who died, and so supposedly where he was shot is haunted. Just all sorts of that whole thing. And battlefields and wars are always things that generate a lot of ghost stories and hauntings. Gettysburg, supposedly the most haunted place in America, and you see that. I mean, really, we could spend a long time talking about why places are haunted, why people think places are haunted. But one of the thing people think is sort of whenever there's sort of emotional trauma, that's the kind of place you're going to find this. And you had a lot of that in Tuscaloosa. And we talked about some of the plantation homes and the people who lived there and the tragedies that affected their lives and how those places were haunted. And just tried to sort of get a cross section of all the different things going on in Tuscaloosa. I mean, turns out Tuscaloosa is a pretty haunted place.
It's an interesting thing about like ghosts, and I didn't even really think about that, but I'm thinking about a lot of the ghost stories that I've heard over time. If you think about them, like one thread that runs through a lot of them, and I say this we collectively, they're places where we've made mistakes, or that we think we've made
Mm.
mistakes. And, like that whole idea of you were thinking about talking about Gettysburg. Well, a lot of that is, the paranormal stuff centers around the battle and the different mistakes that may have been made on a tactical level, or the bigger part of it. You mentioned the Confederate soldier or the Union soldier being shot by the cadets, or wasn't there something also in the book, because I haven't finished it completely, but where there was a spot where Confederate soldiers still march. And like a lot of this stuff seems to connect to places like, like the stories about the woman who's still living in the attic of the house because her husband poisoned her and it was never solved. Unresolved mistakes, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's in the sort of theorizing about ghosts. I think that is a pretty powerful theory that sort of, it's kind of like the unrequited love thing, right? Just the notion of some great mistake or some great loss or some great missed opportunity, a pivot point in life somehow anchors to throughout time, right? Like, because that's the thing. I mean, some people, what is a ghost? Is it the disembodied spirit of a human being? That's what some people would say. Other people would say it's more like sort of leftover energy. It's like residual energy, kind of like if you heat up a piece of steel and you take it off the stove and you let it sit and you touch it, it's still going to be warm because it still has the residual energy of whatever it was that was happening before. And that's what some people think. And we always used to say to people, go, the place that people don't tend to see ghosts are cemeteries, because cemeteries actually nothing happens there. That's not the place where in life things are happening. You don't tend to end up at the cemetery until you're already dead.
Right.
So, that it might be fun to go out to a cemetery and scare yourself, but really that's not where you would expect to see these kind of things
It's
happen.
where things are resolved as opposed to
Exactly.
unresolved. Yeah. Like it's I think about all these things like ghosts, the idea of even, spirits or leftover energy, or the life lessons we were talking about before related to horror. It's almost like the more we talk about this, the more I start to feel like, or even like something as simple as like life is boring without mysteries, or the Pet Cemetery life lessons that are being made. It's almost like we need these things. Like all of these things, whether we're talking about helping children go to sleep at night or learning an important lesson in life that we can't necessarily take straight on, or, the places that we made mistakes. It's almost like we need these things to understand and process the world around us. And maybe I'm being too big about it, but
No, I don't think you are at all. I think that's why they have been with us since the beginning of time and will always be with us. And I think it's why, no matter, you find the person who thinks they're the most rational materialist in the world, they are still going to have these, even if they don't realize it, they're still going to have these things. They're going to be, little suspicions that they have about what's really lurking in the darkness, right? Or they're going to have superstitions that they follow, even if they don't realize it. Or there's going to be legends that live in their mind. I think it is the world, going back to Lovecraft. Lovecraft used to say that, the most merciful thing is that man's mind is unable to conceive the vastness of the universe. Because if you could, it would drive you insane. Like if you could conceive just how vast the universe is compared to us, you would not be able to function. And I think we cannot actually function in life without having some of these things to help us conceptualize that vastness. I think it helps us to understand the world around us and to place ourselves in it. And I don't know how you could do that. If you don't have something that helps you to do that, quantum physics is never going to do it. The more you learn about quantum physics, the more confused you're going to be. Quantum physics isn't going to answer any questions. It's only going to
add more questions, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The closer it gets to truth, the less you'll understand it. That's quantum physics for you. So if you want to try and order your life around the fact that light can be a particle and a wave at the same time, feel free.
Good luck.
But for most of us, we need these things to help us to understand, so we can get through our day-to-day lives. I think that's 100% true, and that's why it will always be with us no matter what.
Yeah, and it's that part, like, to your point, it's that part where science cannot explain everything. It explains so much. And, regardless of whether you're spiritual or not, but certainly if you're spiritual or even if you're not, I think we have to all accept that there's things that we cannot explain with science or even rational thought. And there has to be a space for that, and a space to understand, because no matter how logical or rational we think we are, that there's a part of us that's affected by that or that makes decisions based on that. And I feel like these stories are great ways to sort of explore that in a way that isn't completely unrestrained, that doesn't do what you were saying with Lovecraft, causing all of our heads to explode because of yeah. What about, in comparison, sort of like for you, these things that are sort of, I suppose, sometimes fantastical, mysteries or stories? What about that compared to sort of like the real life nightmares of true crime? What are the differences for you in terms of like exploring those or approaching those?
Well, I think sometimes horror helps us to process the real nightmares out there. And I think you see this in sort of unhealthy way with conspiracies and conspiracy theories. I think it is kind of like we were talking about the vastness of the universe. It is terrifying. It is more terrifying to me to think about how absolutely depraved people can be to each other and the horrible things they can do to each other than to think there's, some non-human monster out there. If there's a non-human monster murdering young girls, we can all band together and go hunt that monster down and kill it. And now we have ended we've done something wonderful together. We've overcome a great difficulty and we've ended its scourge. It will no longer trouble our community, right? Unfortunately, in the real world, you can't do that because it's not just one monster, it's many, and they're people, and they often hide in plain sight. So I often think that horror helps us to sort of conceptualize that and deal with that and experience the bad things that can happen in life from a safe vantage point. Watching horror on your television screen and experiencing it that way is much better than watching the news, frankly.
Right.
I found the news to be far more terrifying than real life horror. And I often say that to people. It always surprises me. We do these October episodes and they're really just true crime, but they've got they'll have like a little hint of whatever. And people are like, oh, I can't listen to that. That's scary. And I think to myself, God,
that's so funny. I find them less scary. Yeah. I'm like,
it's like
okay,
year round, we're talking about real terror.
It's very funny because I feel the same way. I've listened to all of your October episodes so far, and I'm like, yeah, no, not as scary as the September ones. Brianna Maitland scared me a lot more than any of these. But it's funny you said that part, because I think of something like Stephen King's fictional Derry, Maine, and there are a number of his books where it appears in there. I think it started with but it's like transitioned into like a bunch of other ones like Bag of Bones, and then there is a book, Derry itself. But like many of those books have a thread of the whole community banding together to fight this monster, which is so different than I think the reality that we sometimes face when there is a monster, that often the whole community is either not banding together or is almost impotent in comparison to those fictional versions. We're able to fight this monster that goes, like, the monster is almost infinitely more defeatable than the monsters in reality.
No, I think that's true. It's kind of like how when you think about who were like the greatest presidents, you tend to think about presidents during wartime. So, like Abraham Lincoln is a great president. How would Abraham Lincoln have been if there hadn't been a war and he'd had to deal with things like inflation and recessions and unemployment? If those were the things he was focusing on, you know what I mean?
Right.
Things that are much more difficult to get. It's when you have a common enemy, it's easy to get everybody together. And I mean, easy's. I don't want to. I don't want to diminish what Abraham Lincoln did,
right.
but you know what I mean.
Yes,
Yeah,
right.
exactly. It's easier to get everyone together to focus on the common enemy, to put aside our differences, and to do that. But then when you have the real issues, crime's a great example. How exactly do you deal with crime? And it's an intractable problem in the United States. And it's like we swing, the pendulum swings back and forth, right? Like we just going to put everybody in jail. That's what we'll do for a little while. And they're like, no, we should really try and rehabilitate people, which can work if you do it the right way, but not rehabilitation doesn't just mean letting all those people out of prison that you put in prison. Like you actually have to do something to get them to where they can function in society. Because if all you do is let them out of prison, then guess what they're going to do? They're probably going to go commit crimes. And then at some point, your pendulum's going to swing back to putting everybody back in prison. And we just don't have a real good handle on how to deal with crime, how to address these problems, how to keep our community safe, while at the same time, not over policing, not, focusing on the one community to the exclusion of all others. I mean, all these like difficult issues. Much easier to band together and fight the evil clown monster that's eating children every 30 years, right?
Right.
And so I think horror can be, and really all fiction, it can be, what's the word I'm looking for? We're striving toward, it's aspirational, right?
Right.
This is the way we want to be. We want to be able to do this. And in real life, it's much more difficult. But maybe if we can channel those sort of ideas and into things like community, I mean, we've got a lot of work to do. I feel like in our country, we had our common enemy throughout the end of the 80s. We were always fighting the godless communists and the Soviets and everything else. And for all the mistakes made throughout that period, there was something that at least united everybody, which was that. You could disagree about everything else, but at least we had that binding us together. And then the 90s were kind of like the roaring 20s. You're kind of like this period where, everything's great now. We're just rich and, hey, it's the internet and we're all just going to make tons of money on the stock market and all this other stuff. And then 9/11 happens.
Right.
And everything starts sort of fraying. Right. We have that brief moment. I think you've talked about this, how like the day after 9/11, like 9/11 is the worst day.
September 12th. Yeah. Best
but then the day after 9/11, everybody's together. Because once again, we got the monster we're going to go fight. Right.
Right.
And that lasted for a little while, but not terribly long. And then the complications of life began to interfere. And from that point forward, you've just had this sort of continuing fraying, people separating. The internet comes along and it's so easy now just to put yourself in like a small group and hate everybody else, right? It was so easy to find other people who think just like you and think everybody else is a terrible person.
Yeah,
and we talk about community, these communities breaking down, and how exactly, when you don't even have a community, how can the community come together, right? So I feel like that's a thing we have to, and I don't know how you do it, but rebuilding that sense of community so we can all march out together to fight the monster, that is the first thing we have to do. And getting there is going to be the hard part.
And it's not that we need to create a monster, because there are plenty of them that already exist. Yeah. There are plenty. And when you mentioned September 12th, it was a day that it's hard to even describe for me, because I came to work, and this is when the New York Times building was on West 34th Street, and you had these Times globes that were in front of the building. And when the paper rolled out, it was the weirdest thing, that you had people lined up in front of the building trying to get the early morning first editions of the paper that were no longer printed in that building, but were brought to that building in the morning. And the cab drivers weren't honking their horns that day. They were slowly letting people walk through the street. And when you described that, I thought of, like, if you've ever read the book Under the Dome, which is one of King's that also touches on that Derry, Maine community. But that's a day that felt like the day where everybody banded together to fight the monster. And that was an amazing moment. And if I could have repeated it hundreds and hundreds of times or had hundreds and hundreds of days like that over the last decade, it would have been like truly, I think it would have been truly amazing. It would have been transforming for us if we could have kept what we had on that day in motion.
And the thing is, it wasn't a lie, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, the thing about the monster is the monster clarifies how much the differences don't matter. It's not that they don't go away. You know, it's not like we stopped being Republicans or Democrats, or we stopped believing in, like, you know, trade policies or whatever the differences are that divide us. Those things didn't go away, but you recognized in the grand scheme of things, those are pretty minor compared to the fact that we are all in this together. We're part of this one community that's been attacked, that has to respond, that has to care for the people who've lost loved ones, that, you know, all the important things about life were crystallized, and we were able to see it on that day.
Yeah.
And I just feel like, and I see this so often, and I saw it in the horror community and I see it in true crime, where the people involved in those communities are all so different. I mean, you talk about diverse communities, people from every walk of life, every race, every gender, every educational background, every political belief, every religion and lack thereof, right? Vegans to people who only eat steak. I mean, everybody in between. And yet they're able to come together in these communities and be friends with each other and talk about something they care about, and, you know, go to things like Crime Con and meet up and have these great times, and the things that divide them don't matter. And I just feel like if we had more communities like that, some of this divisiveness that we see we might be able to overcome it.
Right.
And that's why I love talking about this stuff with you, because I feel like I never really thought about it until you started talking about it. And now I'm like, that is the thing, you know, that we're missing.
Yeah.
Is we're missing the things that used to tie us together. Because it's not like people in the 50s didn't disagree about stuff, you know?
There was a lot.
Right?
There's a lot.
Some really intense stuff, right? I mean, there were bad things going on back then. But
gives us it gives us something that unites us. So before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance to have any closing thoughts, but what I really want, because this is Halloween, I want movie recommendations too for people for tonight.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends. There are the movies that scare you, and there are movies that are the classics. I'll give you sort of a wide range. So we've already talked about Session 9. Session 9 is a underrated independent film, really amazing. It is going to scare you if you watch it. If you want to see a scary movie, Session 9 is one of those rare movies that will actually scare you. One of my favorite movies ever, if you're on Halloween, and this is cliche, but nevertheless, it's just true, is the original Halloween. If you haven't seen the original Halloween,
good one.
Do it tonight. Tonight is the time to watch it. And it's a movie where, and remind yourself, because sometimes this happens where you're watching and be like, I don't know, this seems kind of cliche. The reason there are parts of it that seem cliche is because it created the cliche. the things that maybe you've seen happen in other movies happen because of that one. And so that one's great. My personal favorite horror movie of all time is the original Nightmare on Elm Street, which
that's a great movie.
And it taps into so many. We've been talking about.
Still scares me.
Yeah, it's still scary. There's just amazing scenes in that movie. If you want something a little different, the sort of a slow burn thing with just an amazing ending. Have you ever seen The Others with Nicole Kidman?
No.
Okay, don't Google it. Don't look into it. Just watch it.
Just watch
Others. Just watch it.
Okay.
It's a great movie. Very sort of unsettling, creepy, and sort of a turn of the screw type way. And then let's see. I'll give you one more so we can do 5. Okay, if you want more of a sort of a body horror type movie, if you haven't seen the original Hellraiser. I think Hellraiser is kind of underrated. obviously most people have heard of it, but it doesn't get the same play as your Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream, that kind of thing. But the original Hellraiser, Clive Barker, mind blowing, so good. But definitely has got the body horror aspect if you're into that kind of gory thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is great. Everyone's going to have a great Halloween. A scary, scary, scary Halloween. It's absolutely, it's very funny. So a lot of people like Christmas. A lot of people like Thanksgiving or Easter. I love Halloween. And there's an interesting reason, I think, why. Like, I've dealt with depression, and in October, that's where you run the risk because the seasons are changing for things to get worse. So I try to focus on the more positive things. And the one thing I think about every Halloween that keeps me going are all the smiling faces of children. So
there you go.
I thought I'd end on that note.
Just remember, always check your candy.
It'll be just fine. Oh, that's a good one, Brett. This is Jayson Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook Podcast. We'll see you all again next week.